Thank you very much, Saud. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum. Let me just say that the way Saud introduced me might seem, to some people at least, so as if I was a hack, wrote articles that got published everywhere with little probably thought going into some of them. That was not the case. Actually, what we are discussing today is something that has been dear to my heart long before it became fashionable. In fact, before 9/11, long before 9/11, I was amongst those who raised the question of where does this movement, which had support across the board, even from U.S. policymakers when we were fighting communism and fighting the Soviets in Afghanistan, where this movement would head once communism is defeated. And nobody had thought that. Nobody gave thought to it. And so what is today the radical problem that the Muslim world faces, and the problem that many in America, especially Muslims in America, face from amongst themselves, and that comes to light every few days when a major issue comes up, whether it is reaction or delayed reaction, ongoing reaction from 9/11, or whether it is a reaction to an incident like the failed and successfully foiled Times Square bombing. People forget that some of it has roots during Cold War strategy, when some people who did not understand Islamic history and tradition thought that it was an easy way of mobilizing the world's Muslim population against communism by injecting this whole notion of a monolithic version of Islam. So my comment is that my observation is that the real solution to Islamic radicalization is the recognition of the diversity of Muslims around the world, as well as within the United States. And I was here, and it's unfortunate that I don't see many of the speakers of the earlier panels in the audience. It often happens when you become professional speakers that you do your speech and you go away. Unfortunately, I might have to do that too. But I have some comments on the speeches that were made earlier in the day, and I would like to make them not in my capacity as Ambassador of Pakistan to the United States, but as an individual. For example, there was some discussion about what is the definition of an extremist, what's the definition of a radical, and I was sitting there and I said, you know what, this is just a very academic discussion. When the pornography case was heard in the Supreme Court, Justice Potter famously said, I don't know if I can define pornography, but I know it when I see it. And we Muslims now, after the setbacks we've had after 9/11, after the discrimination some of us have faced after 9/11, and many people face discrimination, not only in this country, in many other countries, I'll talk about that in a minute. Many of us have woken up to this process called radicalization and extremism, and the ideology called extremism. And we don't necessarily, it's an academic thing, it's useful, it should happen in academia, but very frankly, we know what we are talking about. We are talking about the person who does not think of Islam as the faith of a billion and a half people, who actually thinks that he or some small group of people have the ultimate knowledge of the faith, and they have the right to declare all those who do not adhere to that brand or that version of Islam, they can declare them as unbelievers, as kafirs, that they have the right to take away lives of people who they think do not believe the way they do, and who think that they can actually cause a global revolution by killing innocent children outside the theater showing Lion King. And I think that that is something on which Muslims in the United States, an overwhelming majority, and around the world, is unified. We are not radicals. We do not want radicals. We do not want radicals to define us. Now, some people get into other arguments, As Ambassador of Pakistan, I have made this point since the day I took over as Ambassador. I have consistently made the argument that I represent Pakistan and Pakistan's citizens. Somebody said earlier in the, Pakistan, Islam, there's a special relationship. Of course there's a special relationship, because Pakistan is a majority Muslim country, and Pakistan's constitution confers a special status on believers of the Islamic faith. But that said, the constitution also protects all religious minorities, and in effect, if they are not protected, which is the case, and we are trying to change that under the new democratic dispensation in Pakistan, we have an obligation to stand up and be counted and say that's wrong. It's important for us to say it's wrong instead of making excuses. The young the young man from the school who was telling about people discriminating, yes, fair enough. We should not be discriminated against. But at the same time, we will be less discriminated against if we make it very clear that the labels that are being given to us of terrorist, of extremist, etc., do not apply to us. We have to make it very, very clear. We also have to start standing up with others who are discriminated. So if we are going to stand up against Islamophobia, which is a very legitimate cause for all of us, we should also stand up against anti-Semitism equally. When we say that as a group that is a minority, by the way, in America, the American Constitution does not have the concept of a religious majority and a religious minority. This is just a demographic fact, that a majority of Americans happen to be a certain religion today, but there is no constitutional specialness or specificity for a majority and a minority. So Muslims are just a minority numerically. Otherwise, they are equal citizens. They are equal to every other community. And Pakistani Americans, I always encourage them, and I respect Pakistani Americans, whether they be Muslims, Sunni or Shia, whether they be Christians, and there are Christian Pakistani Americans, by the way, and I respect Pakistani Americans who happen to be Ahmadi, and I respect and represent Pakistani Americans who happen to be Hindu, and I always make it a point of making it clear, and whenever we have an event at the Pakistan Embassy in Washington, D.C., we make sure that it is not an all-Muslim affair, because Pakistan's diversity is its strength, just as America's diversity is its strength. And the Pakistanis and the Muslims who have come to the United States, and I'm using those two terms separately now. The Pakistanis include the Christians, the Hindus, the Ahmadis who came here with Pakistani passports and then applied for US citizenship and became American citizens, which, by the way, is a unique quality of America. It allows people from everywhere in the world to come and become citizens, equal under the protection of the same law. So Pakistani Americans, as well as Muslim Americans, both of them, I think, while it is right and it's absolutely justified for them to demand, it is important that they demand protection of their civil rights and their civil liberties, and there are good organizations in this country that do that, but at the same time they also have an obligation to stand up and be counted for violations of civil liberties and civil rights and human rights in the greater Muslim world. It can't be that when it comes to the causes, the so-called causes in the Muslim world of various issues, of territorial issues, rights issues relating to different communities, different countries, rights of self-determination, etc. At that time, the Muslim American community says, you know what, those issues are our issues. We are unified by them. Well, if you are unified by those issues, you should also be unified in your demand for protection of human rights in the greater Muslim world, from Morocco to Indonesia, because after all, the causes of that part of the world, you know, people speak here about Palestine and Kashmir and many other causes, and it's their right, it's their duty in many cases to do that. But when you do that, also talk about the human rights in the Arab world, and human rights in Pakistan, and human rights in India, and human rights in Bangladesh, and that is important. Somebody said earlier that, you know, what are Pakistanis? We are not Indian Muslims. Of course we are not Indian Muslims. India has its own 170 million Muslims. And that's part of the diversity of the Islamic world. 1.4 billion people in the Muslim world. They can't be monolithic. And so the most important thing for all of you as Pakistani Americans and Muslim Americans is to keep emphasizing this diversity point. Because sometimes in a desire to create Muslim unity, we end up giving the impression that there is a monolithic Islam. Now, if the media portrays Islam in a negative way, we get very angry. But we do it sometimes ourselves by mistake. Because some of us are inadvertently defending people like Bin Laden or the Taliban. Why should we? Do we have an obligation to defend them? If we don't have an obligation to defend them, why don't we stand up and be counted in criticizing them? Openly, directly, looking people in the eye and saying, yes, they are Muslims, but they are not the kind of Muslim I am. Because Muslims are many, many things. Muslims are educated and illiterate. Muslims are politically involved and not politically involved. Muslims live under autocratic governments and they live under democratic governments. Muslims are modern and